Packin Heat by Mike Brooks, read by dyslexic little me. What do I do about a problem like Niswick? This had been the question going around Snuggy Littletooth's head for days, but the answer still eluded him. He should have been Grot boss by now, lauded and celebrated as the greatest Gretchin to have ever lived, and leading his own warg in a glorious crusade against humies, bug eyes, and anyone that wanted to stop him from getting his claws on their stuff. Unfortunately, the orcs over whom he should be ruling had ignored the will of the gods, and after a particularly traumatic journey through some interdimensional portals, he'd ended up here, on a world mainly consisting of grass and dust and mountains, and right back down the pecking order in a completely different warg, the tech warg, and subservient to Niswick.
"Oi, Snuggy!" Niswick hollered. "Bring that oil squig over here!"
Snuggy grimaced, but picked the rotund little creature up and crossed the floor of the big boss bunker to place it in the hands of Niswick as he sat, eyes crossed with concentration in front of the big boss's third favorite slugger. Niswick was another Grot. He was the Grot's Grot. If you took all the Grots in the galaxy, ground them down to their component atoms, and then made the single grottiest Grot you could from what you had, it would look like Niswick. He had everything you'd expect in a Grot: the dagger-like nose, the ragged batwing ears, the long clawed fingers, the pale green skin, and the tattered clothing in the colors of the orcs he served, yellow and black in this case, since the tech warg was dominated by bad moons. On the face of it, there was nothing to distinguish Niswick from the veritable hordes of Grots that existed throughout the galaxy. Snuggy, however, knew better. Niswick was the personal Grot of Uthak Blackhawk, the big boss in charge of this part of the tech warg, and an orc that was not only massive but utterly fearsome. Snuggy did not trust Uthak, not one bit. He was too smart for an orc, too smart by half, with a nasty habit of following facts through to a logical conclusion. An orc that smart was bad news for everyone, or at least bad news for Snuggy, which was basically the same thing. After all, how was Snuggy supposed to have another stab at fulfilling his gods-given destiny and becoming Grot boss if an orc like Uthak was hanging around ready to stomp on him? It was zogging unfair is what it was. Niswick was the key, Snuggy was sure. The other Grot had somehow managed to inveigle his way into Uthak's surroundings and had become, if not actively welcome, at least tolerated, in the sense that Uthak yelled at him to do things rather than get lost. In Snuggy's experience, that was as close an expression of trust as orcs got when it came to Grots. Niswick must have some special understanding of orcish nature in order to manage this, and Snuggy needed it. However, Niswick must also have his own plans. Since no Grot got close to an orc unless he had to, a Grot's natural instinct was to do as little as possible, nick stuff, and throttle anything smaller that annoyed him, while an orc's natural instinct was to make Grots do everything for them except fighting. That was not to say they did not make Grots fight as well, just that the orcs wanted what they considered the most fun for themselves, which meant using Grots as living shields for the dull stuff like getting shot at. It was surely one of the gods' greatest jokes. Snuggy had previously reflected that orcs and Grots were almost always in close proximity to each other. Snuggy's preferred place was well away from an orc's eye, either doing something unimportant that no orc bothered to check up on, or preferably plotting his own accession to glory, while a group of other Grots, convinced of his genius, ran around for him, and they all awaited the perfect moment to overthrow their masters. He had decided to make an exception here, simply because he had to find out what Nisquik was up to. What was his plan? Why did it involve being so close to Ufthak? And how did the deceitful little git manage to never give himself away?
There we go,
Nisquik said with every indication of happiness, squeezing the oil squig onto the slugger. He worked the weapon's action, ensuring the oil was evenly distributed, and the moving parts flowed smoothly past each other, then placed it carefully back. Snuggy watched the whole procedure closely, but saw no sign anything was amiss. The oil was genuine squig oil rather than some corrosive substance, and no miniature explosive had been planted to make the slugger explode if Ufthak fired it. To all appearances, Nisquik was genuinely servicing the big boss's weapons when Ufthak wasn't even around and telling him to do it. The fiendish complexity of it! Snuggy considered himself a strategic mastermind, but this long game was currently beyond his comprehension. He will have to stay on his guard, because Nisquik surely had exactly the same doubts about why Snuggy was here. There were two trampla squigs circling each other, not yet at the stage of snorting and pawing at the ground prior to charging, but definitely eyeing each other up and working out their rivals' intentions. Snuggy was concerned that he was at a disadvantage. Nisquik had been around the tech wag longer, for this was essentially his home turf. He knew the important orcs and what would enrage them, and he knew the hidden strata of Grot society. Indeed, he sat somewhere near the top, based simply on his status as Ufthak's Grot. If Nisquik decided that Snuggy was a problem or a threat, then Snuggy was likely to become Squigfoot after he got blamed for nicking the boffin's hammer wrench or Doc Drozfang's favorite scalpel, even if he hadn't been nowhere near either orc at the time. Perhaps, Snuggy thought, it was time to come clean rather than wait for Nisquik to start hostilities when he was not looking. Nonetheless, this was going to take subtly. "Sir," he said conspiratorially, sitting down on the floor next to Nisquik. "What's the plan?" Nisquik looked at him, his brow wrinkling in confusion.
The plan?
"Yeah," Snuggy prompted. "You know, for the boss." He waggled his eyebrows knowingly.
For the... Oh!
Realization dawned on Nisquik's features, closely followed by suspicion.
How do you know about the plan?
Snuggy suppressed a thrill of excitement that his genius insight had once again been accurate. "Well, sort of obvious. You're gonna have a plan, ain't it?" he said, then realized how that sounded and hastily backtracked. "I mean, not obvious to everyone. Of course not to everyone. But to another Grot who's hanging around and has the same sort of brain," he tapped the side of his nose, "you can trust me. Promise." Nisquik's eyes narrowed.
Promise?
"Promise," Snuggy said, making his own face as open and honest as possible. He did not mention anything about how trusting him only extended so far as him not instantly revealing that plan to Ufthak, and should in no way be interpreted as trusting him not to, for example, quite literally stab Nisquik in the back once he had gleaned every useful scrap of information he could from the other Grot.
Well, all right then, Nisquik said with satisfaction. With two of us, we can get this done. Come with me.
He got to his feet and trotted out of the bunker without a backward glance. Snuggy hurried up and followed him, grinning as he went, eager not to let his newfound trust expire through tardiness. Finally, a breakthrough. Nisquik led the way with the casual aplomb of someone who had long ago learned which squig pants were too ramshackle to venture near in case the occupants got excited at the sight of a grot and burst loose to try to eat you, which areas of open ground you only ventured into if you wanted to get mashed flat by the spirit freaks as they engaged in their near incessant races, and which piles of junk were prone to explode without warning as a mech boy tested his latest invention. Snuggy kept up, storing all this information away for future use and wondering what exactly they were after. Were they stealing a particularly powerful weapon from a mech boy's workshop to vaporize Ufthak when he returned, in order to then take command of the Wog through force of arms? Were they going to nick experimental goblins from a penboy, which they would clamp to Ufthak's skull when he was asleep and somehow control his brain and therefore his behavior? Were they going to stop someone? Apparently not. They passed through the riotous core of the camp, through the bustling markets where teeth were traded for guns and ammo, fungus beer and fried squig legs, new boots and armor with only one previous owner who sold it because he got something better. Definitely not because he died. Ignore the hole in the back of it. That's just for flexibility, so your arms don't get stuck when you're swinging your chopper, right? Then they snuck through where the bulk of the orcs camped down, which was in many respects a lot more dangerous. Orcs in the markets were busy making or selling wares, or buying and testing those wares. A Grot might find himself suddenly used as target practice to test the accuracy of a slugga. But other than getting kicked for being in the way, being victimized by an orc in those surroundings was a relatively rare occurrence. Orcs only tended to turn on Grots when they literally had nothing better to do. Out where the orcs camped, they did not have anything better to do. Any orc who had not found an actual enemy to get stuck into was mooching around, waiting either for the knob to decide, zog this, they were going out to try to find something to fight, or for the distant sound of Daka to be carried in on the breeze, at which point they will take up their weapons and pile off in that direction as fast as possible. A pair of Grots would make a suitable, if short-lived, diversion for any number of the brutes currently kicking their heels. "What are we doing here?" Snaggy hissed, as they weaved their way through the maze of ramshackle huts, crude tents, and rough shelters thrown together from bits of wreckage.
"Gotta get to the other side," Niswick said. "Come on this way."
He picked up his pace, little legs flashing back and forth, and Snaggy had to break into a run to keep up with him. He thought they would have been discovered when a nearby rumble of orc voices rose into a roar, and he had a sudden mental image of being chased and shot at until the sheer volume of fire overcame even the orc's natural lack of accuracy. But then they crept past the back half of a truck, and he saw a big crowd of orcs standing in a circle, far too close for comfort, but all fixated on something in the middle of them.
"This is the best way," Niswick whispered with some satisfaction. "Sneak past them while they're busy."
Snaggy paused for a moment in morbid fascination, as the snarling, snorting shape of a smasher squig ran straight on an orc. Instead of scrambling out of the way, the orc charged it with his own head lowered. There was a sickening crunch on impact, and then to Snaggy's shock, the squig toppled sideways with its eyes rolled back and tongue lolling out, while the orc staggered around in a triumphant circle, obviously woozy, but still on his feet.
"That's just Morgoth," Niswick said dismissively. "He won a headbutting contest with a wall once."
Snaggy started to become suspicious when they made it past the last few shelters and were hurrying across scrubby grass and dusty soil towards the low hills that lay just beyond. However, Niswick wasn't not reaching for his blaster, and Snaggy could not think that the other Grot had set up some sort of ambush with any third party. Strange though it might seem, he had to assume there was a genuine purpose to them coming all the way out here. The best thing to do was to be patient and wait for it to become clear. "What's going on?" he said, grabbing Niswick's arm. "Where are we going?"
"Up there,"
Niswick said, pointing ahead of them. Halfway up the nearest hillside was a dark hole. A cave? Or Snaggy thought, as he squinted up at it, an entrance. There looked to be stones around it, which suggested that someone had thought it was important enough to prop open and mark. "What's that?" he asked.
"I'll show you,"
Niswick replied happily and scurried off again. Snuggy followed him, wondering exactly when the other Grot was going to drop his brainless act. Surely at some point soon they will be able to have a conversation about the nature of Nisquik's plan and how he intended to seize control. The climb up the side of the hill was exhausting, but Grots were naturally fit and resilient, mainly because any Grot that was not could expect to be flattened in short order in the hustle and bustle of an orc camp. When they reached the entrance, Snuggy realized that it had caved in only a few feet back from the outside, leaving a pile of rock and earth that blocked access.
This is a special place for the Scranwies what lived here before the walk came,
Nisquik said, beaming with glee.
They were sort of snake-bite Scranwies, rode around on their visions or squigs, and not many of them had the usual scrawny weapons, but some of them had the good stuff, like the nubs and that. I heard the Boffin tell the boss that there was probably some fancy scrawny weapons in this hill, since they fought really hard to keep us out of it and pulled the roof down at the end. But the boss said he couldn't be bothered to go digging when there was still plenty of scranwies to scrag out here, and then he hauled the Boffin off to do something else. But I remembered.
Snuggy felt a grin of his own creep across his face. Cranwies were annoying gits, all flippy and zippy, so you thought they were not going to do anything. Then, surprise! They had shot you full of their wizard discs and you were in 17 pieces on the floor. Scrawny weapons were weird, but they often hit harder than they looked like they should. And, this was important, they tended to be a lot lighter than orc weapons. That was important. A good shooter weighed as much as a Grot. This made stealing a good weapon from an orc almost impossible, which so far as Snuggy was concerned was just another example of the galaxy's shameless conspiracy against him. Scrawny weapons, on the other hand, Snuggy reckoned he could lift one. Easy. If he could lift it, then he could shoot it. And if he could shoot it, then suddenly the balance of power between him and the orcs had shifted. "Sir, how do we get in?" he asked eagerly. In answer, Nisquik pointed to a small, dark hole at about waist height in the tumbled blockage, where a large stone had become wedged over a couple of others as it fell, leaving a gap beneath.
"Through there," Nisquik said. "That's a start anyway. Ain't this exciting?"
"Exciting," Snuggy muttered, eyeing the hole. Yeah. He thought for a second about how much he would enjoy vaporizing or eviscerating any orcs that got in his way with the treasures that could lie on the other side of this obstacle, and the sheer power he would feel as a result. His accession to Grotbost would be unquestioned, and of course, once he had his hands on whatever lay inside, there was no reason why Nisquik should make it out again. "Yeah," he said with more enthusiasm, heading for the hole. Snuggy Little Tooth had been shoved into worse and small places than this before now, and for considerably less potential reward. Now he was doing it on his terms. "Come to Snuggy," he hissed, clawing his way forward into the darkness. Darkness. That was the problem. It was as dark as the inside of a squig, which Snuggy supposed he should have guessed beforehand. But he pressed on and wiggled his way forwards by touch, silently cursing Nisquik all the way. Why could not the git have told him they were going underground? Well, there was no way he was going to give the other Grot the satisfaction of backing out again and wailing about being unable to see. Claustrophobia was not something you suffered from as a Grot, or at least not for long. Orcs would shove Grots into any small space to find out why something was broken or to try to fix it. And if you panicked and came back out without having done the job, then the orc would probably feed you to a squig. As a result, the only Grots that tended to survive were the ones who had no problem with small spaces, if not actively sought them out, as somewhere orcs could not reach you. Snuggy froze as a new thought struck him. What if Nisquik was even now preparing to bring down the unstable rocks? What if he had identified Snuggy as a rival and a threat, and was seeking to either crush him or trap him here? Being comfortable in small spaces was all very well, but that was assuming there was a way out again. It was a cunning plan. Snuggy could tell because he had just thought of it, and utterly deniable. Snuggy could just hear Nisquik, artfully innocent voice, now explaining things to Uthak.
I told him not to go in, but he wouldn't listen.
Snuggy told himself he was being ridiculous. Nisquik wouldn't have to explain things to Uthak, mainly because the big boss would not care enough to ask. Well, if Snuggy's pride would not let him reverse out, and staying in place and waiting for Nisquik to collapse the entrance on him was not a good idea, which it definitely was not, then the only thing for it was to press on as quickly as possible and get out before his treacherous companion could complete his dastardly deed. Snuggy huffed and wriggled, swimmered and crawled, until finally his groping hands found not just a narrow aperture ahead of him, surrounded by more rock and earth, but an actual opening too. He pulled himself through eagerly, his little pot belly scraping over the last stone, and flopped onto a hard, flat rock surface, presumably the floor of the cave which had been blocked off. The air was warm in here, far warmer than outside, and smelled sour. His head came up as he realized that there was light emerging from the hole out of which he had just exited, and he sat up just in time to see Nisquik's head appear. The git had a lamp strapped to his forehead. "Where do you get that?" Snuggy asked, outraged.
This?
Nisquik looked up towards his forehead, where Snuggy's finger was pointing.
Nicked it off a mech ages ago. Thought you had one? Here you go.
He pulled a similar lamp and strap combination out of his belt pouch and handed it over. Snuggy took it without a word, his inherent distrust at Nisquik not giving it to him at the start not exactly mollified by this act of generosity, more balanced out by a different sort of distrust at it being handed over so casually now. Still, being able to see with both hands free was definitely an advantage.
Right,
Nisquik said, emerging fully from the hole.
Let's get the goods.
He drew his blaster and Snuggy imitated him, partly because he had no intention of letting another Grot be armed next to him without having the means to defend himself, and partly because a nasty thought had just occurred to him.
"Nisquik,"
he said,
"you know, when the Scrawnies pulled that tunnel down, were any of them inside at that time? Like trapping themselves inside with the loot? Waiting to slice us into tiny pieces? Is what I'm getting at."
You know,
Nisquik said cheerily,
I thought they all stayed outside and got stung by the lads, but I could be wrong. Now come on,
he said, forging ahead and brandishing his blaster. Snuggy hesitated for a moment, trapped in an agony of indecision. On the one hand, the sensible thing to do was to back away, squeeze through the holes quietly to return to camp as a casual saunter, and let Nisquik get dismembered by whatever terrifying guardian had been left in here. On the other hand, Snuggy was damned if he was going to let Nisquik get any potential glory for himself, let alone any appealingly powerful scrawny weapons. Being a Grot boss came with responsibilities, damn it! And one of those responsibilities was not letting another Grot have anything better than you did.
"Fine,"
he muttered, slinking along in Nisquik's wake.
"You go first."
The cave tunnel into which they had emerged ran for a short way further, turning a couple of corners as he did so. As they rounded the first corner, Snuggy realized that there was a dim red light from ahead, sufficient to render the tunnel a textured shadow in his vision rather than simple blackness wherever his lamp beam failed to reach. Then they rounded the second corner, and his trepidatious inner musings about the light's origin disappeared in a wash of awe. They had emerged into a much wider cavern, the floor of which dropped away from the stone walkway that ran around the edge and on which they were now standing. Both Grots stopped for a moment and stared about them, the beams of their headlamps skittering off into the red-lit gloom. Snuggy's eyes found shaped rock walls into which had been carved fantastically detailed friezes depicting warriors and combat. He shuddered involuntarily as his eyes lit upon the telltale smooth lines and pointed helmets of scrawny armor, and their slender weapons, distinguishable even when rendered in two-dimensional images. Ranged against them, and dying, were an assortment of foes, many of which Snuggy could recognize from his own heroic adventures around the galaxy in the service of Gork and Mork. There were the heavy-shouldered, pointing-nosed shapes of Beakies, real, proper Beakies, like all the boys said used to show up for fights, not the new-flanked version with flat faces. And their weedy little regular Humie mates, the four-armed, many-toothed bug-eyes and their various weird beasties, even a few short, thickest shapes with prominent beards which Snuggy took a moment to place.
"Wow," he said. "I ain't seen a stunky in ages."
These gates really like making rock look like something else, innit?
Nisqui commented, staring around.
How bored do you have to be to look at a rock and think, you know what there's neat? A picture of me and all me mates on it.
Snuggy took a tentative step towards the edge, wary both of treacherous footing and the potentially treacherous grot next to him, and looked down. The strange sour smell he had already been detecting rose up and smacked him in the nostrils along with a great rush of heat. Eyes watering, he squinted downwards into the red glow and saw, through heat haze that made the air shiver and shake, a pool of molten rock. Most of the surface was a thick crust of black, but it was shot through with cracks and veins of liquid fire, and as he watched, a portion of it went gloop and bubbled upwards, bursting with a wet slowness that revealed a fiery, furiously intense cherry red beneath. "Urk," he muttered, backing away hastily. Still, they were here, and there was no other option except to go back, so he began to make his way cautiously along the rock path that ran around the wall to the right.
You'd think there'd be a rail or something,
Niswick said uneasily, pressed up behind him a little too close for Snuggy's comfort.
"Scrawny place, innit?" Snuggy pointed out. "If you trying and stop and the gates will jump up and balance on the blade edge. They don't need a rail to stop them falling anywhere."
Not that rails were a prominent feature in much orc engineering either, but that was less because orcs had an innate sense of superb balance and more because watching other orcs fall off things was funny. They edged forwards and downwards because the path was starting to dip. Snuggy was a little unnerved by that, but although it was hard to see in the fire-tinted darkness, there looked to be an opening off into the stone wall on the right, well before the path ran on down to the level of the molten rock pool. He began to pick up his pace a little bit, eager to get into a side chamber and away from the source of the sulphurous stink, and realizing that once you had become accustomed to the idea of burning death awaiting you below, the path itself was not that narrow. It did not show any signs of weapons through. Another grot, a grot less blessed with intelligence, might have made some comment of that nature to Niswick. They might have highlighted how their expectations were not being met, or even uttered dire imprecations for what might happen if the state of affairs did not change. Snuggy, of course, was far too wily to do such a thing. He was going to engage in a vicious, bloody betrayal. No, that was negative attitude. When he was going to engage in vicious, bloody betrayal, he would do so without having given any warning of his intentions beforehand, in order to ensure maximum effectiveness and minimal risk.
"So," he said brightly, "got any ideas where we might find the loot?"
Try that cave up ahead, Niswick replied excitedly. That looks like the sort of place you might find something good.
Snuggy had, of course, already thought such a thing, only he had done so in far less pathetic language. He was somewhat taken aback by the lack of any sign of betrayal so far, but Snuggy was not going to demand to know Niswick's true plans when there was a pool of molten rock so nearby. Let him have his fun, and think Snuggy was still taken in. That just meant that when Niswick attempted his own inevitable betrayal, he had no idea that Snuggy was ready. The heat got more intense the lower they went. We just want to show that Meg Zackblotz had been wrong about his claims that heat rose. But what could you expect from an orc? Snuggy's skin was starting to feel a little tender by the time the cave entrance loomed up. He ducked into it gratefully and advanced into the darkness, almost as glad to be moving away from the molten rock as he was to be heading towards something that might actually make this journey worthwhile. And there it was, ahead of them. The cave led to a chamber, far smaller than the one behind them, but still many times Snuggy's height, and a goodly distance from wall to wall. It was illuminated by the faintest light from cut crystal set in scones, and whoever had carved the walls outside had really let themselves go in here. Calling plants and leafy vines so realistic that Snuggy almost expected them to sway in a non-existent breeze, reached up towards the depiction of a sun that occupied the ceiling, and trailed between archways that contained wondrously detailed statues. Nisquik yelped suddenly, and Snuggy whirled around with his blaster leveled, only to find the other Grot on his backside on the floor and chuckling ruefully.
"Does feel shocked, it,"
Nisquik said, pointing. Snuggy peered and gave a start of his own. Lurking half hidden behind the carved creepers was a monstrous reptilian shape, so artfully rendered that it looked exactly like a predator waiting to spring.
"Pull yourself together,"
he snapped, not wishing to admit how startled he'd been.
"Look! Look!"
There was a plinth in the middle of the room, the sides of which were decorated with more reptiles, long sinuous shapes covered with thousands of individually carved scales, and with flames erupting from their mouths, and so interwoven that every space between two of them appeared to be occupied by yet another. However, it was not the artwork that had grabbed Snuggy's attention, but what rested on the plinth's flat top. It was a gun. It was a scrawny gun. It was smooth and largely matte black, with a cylindrical canister set on the underside just in front of the firing mechanism, and a roughly conical fire red barrel which narrowed to something that looked like a nozzle. It was beautiful and deadly and glorious. Snuggy wanted to hold it and fire it more than he had ever wanted anything in the galaxy.
"Oh,"
Nisquik said, getting up with his eyes wide.
"What do you think it is?"
"There's all these pictures of fingers breathing fire, and it's in the cave next to a pool of melty rock,"
Snuggy pointed out.
"So I reckon it's one of their fancy burners."
He shoved his blaster into his belt and flexed his fingers avariciously as he reached out with both his hands. This was not something you just grabbed. He wanted to make it a moment, something that divided his life between the before, when he did not have the burner, and after, when he did have the burner, and everyone who had wronged him was going to be Snorri.
"Snuggy?"
He gritted his teeth in frustration. Nisquik was definitely going to be the first on the sorry list.
"What?"
"Did that statue just move?"
Snuggy looked around. The statue in question was of a scrawny warrior, complete with blank-eyed helm, but in somewhat different armor to what Snuggy had seen before. It was less form-fitted, more obvious plates with soft cloth between, and a cloak of actual fur that looked far too primitive for most Scranwies. This must be a representation of one of the Beast-Naga types Nisquik had mentioned, the backwater Scranwies who lived on this world and were in the process of being exterminated by the Tech-Wag. It was so lifelike that in the dim light, the stone it was carved from almost seemed to possess actual color.
"Nah," he said, staring at it. "It was just your imagination."
The scrawny moved. It lurched forwards, bringing a long blade up in his left hand. Snuggy made an abortive grab for the burner, then jerked backwards as the blade came down where his wrist had been a moment before. The edge bit into the stone, and the scrawny took a moment to heave the blade out again, giving Nisquik a chance to empty his blaster in its direction with an ongoing scream that appeared to be in defiance of the notion of concepts like breathing and airflow. The wall behind the scrawny popped and puffed with dust and chips of stone as the slag struck home, but as Nisquik's blaster ran dry and his scream finally tailed off, the scrawny itself remained unhurt. It looked down at itself in apparent disbelief. Then its head snapped back up and it finally pulled its sword free again. "Oh, it's a ghost! It's a ghost!" Nisquik wailed, backpedaling until he came up against the wall behind him.
Nah, you just can't shoot.
Nisquik snarled, howling his own blast out of his belt. The scrawny stepped forwards again, blade swinging menacingly, but Snaggy had seen real scrawny warriors in action, and although this one was not a ghost, it was certainly only a pale shadow of its skin. It was slow and clumsy in comparison, and where its first thrust should have spitted him like a roasted squig, he was able to dodge aside from it and fire 2 shots. The first one struck the scrawny in the chest, and the force of the impact stopped it in its tracks. The second took it in the right knee and blew the joint out in a spray of blood and bone. The scrawny collapsed with a grunt of pain, and Snaggy put his neck shut right between where his eyes presumably were under its helmet. The shock knocked it into its back. The strange substance scrawny used as armor cracked and split, and the parts of the helmet fell away to reveal a face that even Snaggy recognized as old. The hair was white and lank, the cheeks were shrunken and lined, the eyes milky and struggling to focus. How long had it been standing here, guarding that weapon, waiting for an intruder or perhaps one of its own kind to show up and take it to use in battle? Snaggy did not know and realized he did not care. The only thing standing between him and his destiny was at the end of his gun, and he was about to— "Out of the way, Snaggy! I'm gonna toast him!" Snaggy looked around in horror. But sure enough, Nisquik had hauled the burner, Snaggy's burner, off the plinth and was fumbling it around to aim it at the scrawny. Snaggy saw red. Absolute fury washed through him, fury mixed with envy. And Nisquik being the first Grot to ever get their hands on that beautiful death machine, and also mixed with trepidation, because he was standing directly in front of the gun, and Nisquik's finger was slipping closer to the firing stud, and Snaggy was not sure that the other Grot was going to have either the ability or inclination to stop it. Snaggy said, and he dived to one side. On the floor, the scrawny laughed, a harsh, broken sound flecked with pain and malice. Snaggy had just enough time to wonder what that was about, and then Nisquik fired the burner and Snaggy's eyeballs fused to the back of his skull. Or at least that was what it felt like. The weapon's beam was a lance of acetylene fire, even harsher than normal in this gloom, which scored a line across Snaggy's vision so bright and lingering that for a moment he struggled to tell whether his eyes were open or not. When he began to make out details again, the scrawny was mostly gone. Its legs were still there, although the upper edges of the remaining fabric were on fire. The lower half of its torso was a blackened ruin, which flaked away into ash around about the chest area, and everything about that was just, well, gone, unless you counted the black smear on the floor or the fine particles that now laced the air. "Whoa," Nisquik said happily, grinning from ear to ear. "This is amazing." "That's mine," Snaggy growled, but he growled it very quietly, because it was unwise to show aggression in front of a Grot who could vaporize you with a twitch of his finger. Then he blinked.
Are my eyes still messed up? Or is that glowing?"
Lines of cold light had descended from the top of the plinth, and were now spreading across the floor. Snaggy scrambled out of the way of one of them, which ran on and into the wall. Something above them creaked. Snaggy looked at the now empty plinth, at the gun in Nisquik's arms, thought back to the scrawny laughing in the face of its impending death, and put things together faster than our mech boy on fungus drops. "Look it!" he yelled, getting to his feet and bolting for the tunnel that would take them back to the main cavern. "I'm right behind you," Nisquik said encouragingly as Snaggy shot past him. There was an almost overwhelming urge to turn, to insist that Nisquik go first and then shoot him in the back, steal the burner and leave him here. But even Snaggy's greed took orders from his self-preservation. He ran on as fast as he could, relieved to hear Nisquik's feet pattering on the stone behind him. At least the kid was bringing himself along so Snaggy could slit his throat and get the weapon off him later. He slowed and cut hard left at the main cavern, pounding up the rock path as fast as his feet could carry him. The cold light was keeping pace, spreading out and running angular lines through the carved friezes, casting new shadows over the sculpted figures as it went. Snaggy yelped in terror as a large piece of the cavern ceiling plummeted into the fire lake and disappeared with a glutinous splash that sent tiny red-hot particles of molten rock arcing up into the air and down around him on the path.
Keep running,
Nisquik wailed from behind him.
What do you think I'm doing?
Snaggy bellowed, hopping and leaping over sizzling blobs. Why did the scrawnies have to be so greedy that they set up their cave to collapse when someone took their stupid gun without doing some sort of stupid ritual or whatever was required, when they were not even using the Zokin thing? The tunnel by which they had entered was coming up now. Another bit of ceiling rock dropped, this one only missing the path by the width of a starved snotling, and Snaggy ran on while looking upwards, hoping against hope that he wouldn't see a large bit of darkness suddenly growing in his vision too big to avoid. Then he looked down again, panicking about tripping over something and falling headlong into the fire lake. Look up, look down, look up, look down, running all the while. Tunnel! He clattered desperately into it, well aware that he was doomed if the ceiling started coming down in here too. But what was his alternative? He took the bends at speed, bouncing off the walls, and dived headfirst at the gap in the rockfall that had led to the outside world. It was easier now he had a headlamp to let him see what he was doing, and he squirmed back out far quickly than he'd made it to begin with. He hauled himself up, ready to run and get fully clear of the hill. He stopped. He could see daylight now, and the threat of entombment and crashing felt considerably less. Maybe if he pulled his blaster out and waited, he could get Nisquik as soon as he poked his ugly little head out of that hole, and then get the burner and run. Yes, that was a good plan. The sort of cunning plan that was worthy of a Grot boss. He eased his blaster free. The barrel of the burner emerged first, pointed straight at his face. Snaggy hurriedly shoved his blaster away so that by the time Nisquik's head emerged, he was standing there innocent as you liked, without any sign of betrayal.
Thanks for waiting,
Nisquik said cheerfully, extricating himself from the hole, while somehow the barrel of the burner never quite wavered far enough away from Snaggy for him to risk going for his own weapon again. Then the other Grot pulled out a piece of fur, the remnants of the scrawny's cloak.
What's that for?
Snaggy asked, bewildered.
Cunning, eh?
Nisquik said with a grin. He warped it around the burner.
If thought the orcs would be less likely to try to steal the gun from us on the way back through the camp if they couldn't see it.
Good thinking,
Snaggy said, nodding. The blasted barrel was still a bit too close for him for comfort.
Yes, sure, you don't want me to carry it for a bit? You had to get it out of there after all. Must be heavy.
No, it's fine, Nisquik said, beaming. Honest, I'm good. You go on and check the route back to the Boost Barker. I'll be right behind you.
Right behind me? Yeah.
With few other options available and unwilling to stay in place any longer in case this part of the hill did decide to collapse, Snaggy turned and led the way out while fighting the uncomfortable feeling that he had been outwitted. The trip back through the camp was nerve-wracking, but successful. The sun was setting, and although the orc camp was never a silent and peaceful place, a fair percentage of its inhabitants worked on the basis that going to sleep will make the next battle arrive sooner. Snaggy and Nisquik made it through without being shot, stamped on, or harassed over the nature of the fur-wrapped bundle in Nisquik's arms, and found Uthak's banner just as empty as when they had left it some time earlier.
The boss must still be out hunting scrawnies,
Nisquik said knowledgeably.
There's only a few left. We'll just have to wait for him.
He pointed.
You hide in that corner, and I'll hide in this one. And then when the boss comes back...
He stroked the burner lovingly and grinned wildly.
Surprise time!
Snaggy nodded and retreated to where he had been directed. This was fine. He could still turn this to his advantage. The important thing was that Ufthak died. After that, Snuggy could slit Nisquik's throat while the Git was celebrating and claimed the glory for himself. They waited and waited as the sky outside darkened from blue down to black. Snuggy was just starting to think that the big boss had rumbled their scheme and was too savvy to come back into his bunker when the door opened and the massive shape of Ufthak, Blackhawk, strode in. He was immense, a giant in black and yellow, one hand cloudily clutching the snazhammer, a weapon easily as tall as a human, probably heavier. He threw it into a corner with a clatter and a grunt, and Snuggy nearly jumped at the noise. What was Niswing waiting for? Ufthak was going to notice them at any second, and then, surprise! Niswing jumped out, gleefully brandishing the burner. Ufthak whirled around shockingly fast for something approximately the size and weight of a kilocan, and glowered fiercely at the Grot.
What the fucking hell do you think you're playing at?
He thundered. Go on, Snuggy silently urged Niswig.
Do it! Roast him before he realizes something's up!
We got you a present, boss,
Niswig said happily, and he held the burner out. Snuggy's jaws dropped as a sucker punch of dismay, betrayal, consternation, and utter fury socked him in the face. What was? Why was? This wasn't fair.
What is?
Ufthak growled, snatching the burner from Niswig and peering at it. The weapon looked tiny in his massive hand.
It's a burner, boss, Niswig guessed. It's a scrawny gun, what such really hot stuff that burns gets right up.
Ufthak grunted. And then, without apparent effort, he closed his fist and crushed the burner.
Do I look like I want a fucking scrawny gun?
He bellowed.
Bloody unreliable tross is what that is.
He ripped the canister of the ruined weapon and threw it at Nisquik, hitting the Grot in the chest and knocking him over.
That's the fuel thingy. Take it to the buffet and see if we can make something useful with it. Now get out!
He suddenly noticed Snuggy, and his huge head whipped around to skewer him to the wall with a glare.
And what are you doing here?
Through the sweeping despair and tattered ruins of his ambition, Snuggy managed to point a finger at Niswick.
It was his idea!
He launched forward, grabbed the other Grot, and towed him out of the bunker by the scruff of his neck. Uvdak slammed the door behind them, and Snuggy whirled around to press Niswick up against the wall.
What? He hissed. The Zag was that?
Niswick's eyes were wide with shock.
What was what?
The realization hit Snuggy like a hammer. He had been wrong. He had been so wrong. He had assumed that Niswick had got close to Ufthak because he was a cunning, because he was scheming, because essentially he was like Snuggy. He could not have been further from the truth. Niswick was not pretending to be clueless, a servile Grot with the intelligence of a concussed squig. He was exactly that. Snuggy had grossly overestimated him, and in so doing had lost the one shot he'd had at taking the big boss down and seizing his destiny.
This is what I get,
he said to the galaxy in general.
This is what I get for assuming anyone else will be even as brilliant as me. Why am I cursed with greatness? Why?
What? Niswick asked. Snuggy could not bring himself to answer. He just turned and walked away, back out into the darkness. Sometime later, in amongst the ongoing noise and bustle that forever permeated an orc camp, the careful listener might have heard the sound of weeping, interspersed with the dull, rhythmic noise of a Grot repeatedly driving his own skull into a sheet of metal out of sheer frustration.
Wog!